Hello, everyone. Welcome to Genealogy Adventures. I'm Brian Sheffy.
And I'm Danya Williams. We're in our new studio.
Yay!
Yay!
Well, actually, our old studio, but it's
Oh,
had a complete facelift.
yes, a good renovation, a good renovation. I hope you guys are doing well. I just got a message from somebody saying I can't find the feed. We're just on, so I hope you have found it.
So, like I said, it's an exciting day. Like I said, back in the studio, it feels kind of like a homecoming. So, just really happy to be here. Thank you all for joining us, and we have a really, really brilliant session for you today. Well, all of our episodes are brilliant, but really excited about this one.
Yes, yes. This one is awesome.
I am pleased, well, both of us are pleased to welcome to the show Dr. Nafeez Khan, who's an associate professor at Clemson University. He is also a curricular advisor for the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, which is what this show is all about. He serves on the African Diaspora Consortium, and he also works on the advisory committee of the diaspora. So he is very, very steeped and very, very knowledgeable about the African diaspora and kind of how our African ancestors started coming here. So with all that, Nafeez, thank you so much and welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. Absolutely.
Okay. So I guess just getting straight into it, what was it about the African, or if you want to talk a little bit about your background and how you got involved with the African diaspora and it seems as though have made it your life's calling to do this work.
Well, thank you. Thank you, for this opportunity. A few different avenues that kind of come together, I think is the best way to think about it. A confluence of factors, if you will. So my background, I'm originally from New York, mother's from Jamaica, father's from India. And so in that way, kind of just part of the diaspora, if you will, right, in those experiences. But more directly, it wasn't until graduate school when I was doing work on, and I was taking a graduate history course on the history of Brazil. And the question, the information around the fact that Brazil has currently the largest African descendant population outside of the continent of Africa. And even though growing up, I knew that there were Black folks outside of, across the globe, but you didn't understand the scale of it, right? I didn't necessarily really think consciously about how many or just where people were. And so that kind of, sparked a curiosity. It's like, wait a minute, how are we learning about it? How are we talking about it? How do we remember it, right? So my direct field is in education. And so I look at how the history of slavery more specifically, but history of slavery, the slave trade and the like are presented in textbook, right? What kind of narratives are told? And often they're very singular and narrow, right? We talk about our own country, but we don't kind of get a sense of that scale. And so that's kind of what brought me into, the more particularly working with the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, the Slave Voyages Project beginning in 2006. I started with the project right after it received funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities while I was at Emory University, and to move it from a CD-ROM to online and make it freely available. And so I joined the project just around there as this curriculum development advisor, and then I've worn a ton of different hats throughout this endeavor and continue to do so. So I feel kind of lucky in that I wasn't a traditional historian. I came in from the idea of, well, how are we learning about it? How are we teaching about it? How are we sharing these narratives, these stories as an educator? And so that's been kind of my perspective in kind of making sure it's shared and disseminated in ways that are, for lack of a better word, digestible, right? And engaging, and to think about those questions that it's not just simply, taking the archive and making it online. It's also how can we help people to navigate it as best as possible.
Excellent. Well, I, for one, and I know many, many others, genuinely appreciate your work. And I'm trying to think of the best way to summarize this without giving you like the War and Peace. So I do have a number of identified Africans in my family tree. So there's the 1619 Africans that came from Ndongo that were brought to Jamestown. So they're fairly well documented. We know the name of the ship. We kind of know the whole skullduggery that happened around them. My next ancestor was a woman called Venus, who was smuggled into North Carolina about 1819, 1820. So that was long after the importation of Africans was made illegal. So because she was smuggled into North Carolina, we'll never know what ship she came on or any of that, because they were breaking the law. So they hit their tracks.
But wasn't the Clotilda, wasn't that one an illegal one as
That
well?
was illegal too. That was very illegal.
Yeah.
Considering how late that was.
Yeah.
But my introduction to the slave trade database actually happened during, I've got a wonderful team researching the Weeping Time people with me. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, those are the 440 people sold by Pierce Meese Butler in Georgia over 3 days. And there's a whole group that are working on tracing the lineage to the present day, finding their descendants. I'm working on the strand that's pushing the story back to their African ancestors who were brought here by Henry Lawrence and also a slave importation firm called Middleton and Brailsford. And luckily for me, Middleton and Brailsford, they all did. They advertised each lot of enslaved Africans that were being imported. So I had the name of the ship, which they always included in their advertisements, the name of the captain, how many Africans there were, and where they came from. And then because of that, I was able to go to your database online, and again, thankfully that it's freely available. And I was actually able to get much more information on those ships. Particularly the name of the captain was confirmed, exactly where they came from was confirmed, but it also gave you the whole list of the crew member. Because again, a lot of people who are descended from these people have what they don't understand in their DNA results. Why am I showing this? Why am I showing that?
They're connected.
Well, it's a slave ship. It took weeks, if not months, to get here. The men on the ship being the men on the ship, and they had lots of enslaved females.
And they did what they did.
They did what they did. So I've made note of all of that. So basically, if anyone is showing kind of what seems like a confusing DNA result, they go to the Genealogy Adventures tree and they look at the Molly and Matilda that rocked up in Charleston or Beaufort around 1764. Oh, that's why I've got Snow DNA. Look at that. There was a Snow who was actually on the ship. So for me, that's been brilliant. And I've got a lot of questions about ship logs and things like that to ask you later on. How difficult was it for you to actually get a hold of that information, to be able to summarize it on the website? And also how, I don't want to say reluctant, I don't want to make it sound negative. What level of cooperation did you get from the rights holders to be able to release that information?
Oh, no, those are wonderful questions. So the work that culminating in the website is actually, decades old, well before I ever, began with this project in 2006. But, in the 70s and 80s, the historians who were working on the slave trade, in particular the economic historians, they were scattered. They were wherever they were across the globe, in England and Brazil, in the US and New Zealand. And it kind of, there's a kind of a story where David Eltis, who's kind of the main principal investigator, kind of the main historian who kind of envisioned this, had a chance meeting in an archive with, I believe it was Steve Barrett, who's another historian. I believe he was based in New Zealand. And they had their own individual archives, right? They had their own collection that they identified within British archives, British National Archives, Maritime Archives. But it was scattered, right? Each one were only publishing in their little kind of corner of the trade. And that conversation began, and it took about a decade and a half for the technology to come around to make it a CD-ROM, right? But, the CD-ROM was a major jump forward. But at the time, so this is 1999 when it was finally published. So this chance meeting in the 1980s kind of took decades to culminate and to get historians to agree to share the information that they had been collecting over careers. And that CD-ROM, though, as an important step forward as it was $300, right? I actually still have it on my shelf. it's $300, right? I mean, who realistically can purchase that? It's you're pretty much institutions, universities, or anyone who just has that kind of disposable income. And CD-ROMs are limited, right? You can't update them as easily, right? You have to make a whole new data set. Further, the number of records on the CD-ROM were 27,000 voyages, right? In which a voyage is counted as when they leave their their home port, head to one or multiple ports to purchase enslaved Africans, and then across the Atlantic to sell, and then wherever their end port was. It could be to return back to Liverpool, for example, or whatever happened. So that'd be one voyage, right? So those 27,000 of them. But there was a huge lack of data from Brazil, in particular Brazil, that, you know, they knew that Brazil and Portugal collectively were the largest slave traders, but they didn't have access to that because the relationships weren't there. The historians weren't participating in the same way. So there was a known gap, and it was a huge gap at that, right? So all that being said, so it was the government records, court records. It was the rights holder doesn't come in the same degree, right? And one of the things that's really, I think, for people to kind of dive into if they're interested in finding out, is the sources are all listed for every voyage record. There's at least, I think the number is about 70% of the voyages has at least 2 to 3 sources. Some have as many as 6 or more. Others sometimes only have 1, right? There's only an advertisement, only 1 bill of sale that indicates that this ship had occurred. But what that means is you can kind of track down who's holding that record, right? That logbook, that advertisement, that court record that speaks to this particular, and it's both primary and secondary sources in many cases. So the sources as a kind of there's actually 5 databases on the site, and I can talk about them a little bit later, but as almost another database in and of itself, the sources kind of speak to that idea of where are they, right? Where is this information? One other thing I will share that was shared with me of a kind of one of the harsh or the unfortunate realities of doing historical work is there's a component called the African Names Database, which it's a very narrowly kind of experience, and I'll go into further what it means, but it's 93,000 names of individuals who were sold on board slave ships, but then were freed for varying reasons, and the names were recorded. And the story was David Eltis and another Nigerian historian, Ugo, got to blank on the second name, but it'll come back to me. He's at UCLA. They were in the archives in Nigeria, and they took a photograph of a logbook of the names. And as they turned the page disintegrated. Wow. And so there's that moment of, you know, they took the picture, you know, thankfully, but then it's gone, right? Because archives across the globe have varying abilities, capabilities, and I'm trying not to say standards, but just, you know, capabilities in terms of preservation. And so that particular logbook, you know, that page is now gone, right? Those names are gone. And so there's that kind of component in addition to, as your question around navigating kind of collections. The one thing in terms of rights, images, it comes up a bit more. So there are images on the site, and those are the ones that it's not a large collection, but those are the ones we secured copyright, you know, approval from primarily the British National Museum, I believe, for most of them. But yeah, you still do have to negotiate those things. But the actual data set, right? Since these are not the images of the primary source documents, it's kind of the data from them. They're still, you're not kind of reprinting kind of those archives in that.
Okay. One quick question I have, sure. Hopefully it's quick before I give you a question from D. Turner. Is I'm at the stage of my research where I am trying to find the individual ship logs. Mm-hmm. And again, just to remind everyone, for the period that I'm looking at, this is the colonial period. So those records will not be here in the United States. Mm-hmm. These records were part of, at least the ones that I'm looking at, are part of is it called the the Royal Africa Company's logs, because that's basically the company that was controlling slavery from Britain at any rate. So I have emailed now probably 11 different British repositories, asking if they have ever heard of these ship logs. I've even given them the dates. This is the ship, this is the captain, this is the date, this is where he left, this is where he arrived, and he went back to either Bristol or Liverpool, depending on the ship, and saying, do you have a log? This is why I'm researching anything that I can find of those logs that will give me some idea of the grouping of Africans. Because to see the number, there are 350 people from the Congo on a ship. It doesn't tell me that much, except there were 300 people. Thanks to your website, I know how many of the people that they originally transported died between Africa and here. But I'd like to see breakdowns on the number of men, the number of women, the number of girl children, boy children, and I hate saying this, they're infants. We were talking about last week's show, getting your mind and spirit right. You think there are babies
I was,
on those
because
ships.
you started asking the question, because that was, what he had just said was leading me to that, but I want you to go ahead, because I'm going to that.
Well, you get the alley-oop.
Yeah, I'll get the alley-oop.
Have you ever heard of there being ship logs that still exist?
Yeah, I mean, definitely there are. I mean, I don't know offhand and aware if there's a larger collection. So just the reason why I know, one of the later ships, the Wanderer, which arrived in Georgia, another one kind of the illegal ships that came, I think it was 1858. I believe it arrived off the coast of Georgia. And I think it was Charles Lamar, I think it was the owner who kind of initiated this ship. But that logbook is actually in Atlanta at Emory University in the Rare Collection Archive, like the actual logbook.
That's the same ship that the Roots guy. That's where his family. That was.
Oh yes.
Yeah, that's the Wanderer. That was where his family came off of.
Yeah, and it's relatively recent, right? I mean, that's 2 years before the Civil War. And actually, for a while, people assumed it was actually the last ship without recognizing the Clotilda, which was in Alabama. Even though what's interesting, the Clotilda was in that database from 1999, but it was kind of overlooked for whatever reason. As in terms of who's saying the last ship, right? I mean, it's kind of an odd signifier. But anyway, so there are, I know I have colleagues friends of mine who work in colonial Spanish, kind of the colonial Spain and their purview, and they're, in archives in Puerto Rico, in Spain, of course, and they're able to find those records as well, in Havana, another one. So they're there, but again, I mean, I think to your point, right, what the condition is, what the availability of it, is it a rare books collection type of archive, right? It is a lot more challenging. And I think, I mean, I think that'd be, they're there, but I don't know offhand if it's like, the percentage of how many are surviving at this point, right?
Yeah, I have a feeling I just have to keep lighting the fire under, because I've got dual citizenship. I'm also British. So I can, as a Brit.
Oh, sorry, just to add in, like, kind of, as I'm sure you've done so, well, is the idea of like, you taking bits and pieces and trying to put it as a puzzle, right? So if you're looking for the logbook, maybe was there ever an insurance record or a court record, right? Kind of diving into those tangential elements to the story of any given ship and or their owners, right? Were they written up somewhere else? Were they, since you have names and a time frame, it's such an important parameter. Those are really important parameters to kind of see, all right, if I can't get the physical logbook of that ship, maybe I can kind of speak to it in another way, indirectly, right?
Right.
And the good thing is, well, not that there can be a good thing on the topic that we're discussing, but all of the major repositories in South Carolina that I contacted, they are exceedingly interested in this. So, but your follow-up question was?
Well, my follow-up question was, how are you able to deal with all this? I mean, God, I'm having the trouble that I'm having just by finding endogamy in my family. And so to have to deal with actually seeing these logbooks with these names in it, I purposely did not get involved with the Pierce Butler thing with you, because I knew I wasn't able. I knew that I wasn't able. I would have jumped in. I would jump in, but I wasn't able. I didn't think that I would really be able to take seeing so much of people being sold. I mean, where our family is from, they have this nice thick book, and it's a thick book. And I just took the liberty one time of just counting the rows and counting the pages, and just looking at that book by itself. It was 15,000 slaves in it. That's not, and that was the least amount, because you still had Tom with Silva, Negro, woman, and child all on one row. So it wasn't necessarily, you know what I'm saying? So that was a lot to even to take the fact that I sat there and I'm like, why did I mentally count this? Because now I will never get that number out my head, that there are 15,000 people plus in this book who were enslaved, and the majority of them are probably my family. So how did you do that? How are you prepping yourself for this?
Yeah. Well, I would say it's an ongoing, right? I don't think you reach a point where it's just, you just handle it, right? I think every time I interact, every time I do a conversation or a presentation or teach about the website to varying audiences, right? So last week I was speaking to a group of burgeoning teachers. I think in 2 weeks I'll be speaking to current teachers around using it. It kind of reminds me, and I always have to kind of prepare myself in how I talk about, in particular, the slave trade, in that sometimes for some it might be easy to think of it as numbers, and that's a horrendous way to do so, right? Where you just see numbers after numbers, and you're like, these are all lives that were, stolen, cut short, and the like, right? And it's connected to you, right? You feel it, and you have to sit with it. I will say, in many ways, I think I was lucky in most of my kind of engagement with history has always been a little bit more, for lack of a better phrase, and kind of the personal, if you will, right? Kind of concerning about the lived lives. And I don't know, that might have come from conversations with my father, with my mother, and just that idea of like the power of those stories. So when I encountered and began working with these massive numbers, it wasn't as much of a jump to maintain that sense of, these numbers are all stories. These numbers are all lives. However, that doesn't make it easy, right? You're alluding to the idea of the infants, right? So in that African names database, that particular one, the names were written down for people, and actually it's their African names, or an attempt at the spelling of the African names. But for babies and infants, oftentimes they were just written as boy, infant, child, baby, and they're right. They even record the height of a baby, 24 inches, 17 inches, right? They're taking down all this information, and as you're thinking about it, there's a level of anger. There's a level of pain, in the sense of, this is. How do you even begin to try to reconcile what they went through, right? And then there's a sense, I will, in all honesty, there's a sense of resiliency, right? There's a remarkable element to that, how, if you want to characterize it as Black joy, or just kind of the struggle, if you will, like keeping those thoughts in mind simultaneously as you're looking at a logbook, as you're looking at a table of a bill of sale, or the drawings of a cross section of a ship, right? And you're seeing the bodies laid out. You're kind of holding and staying with all those, right? So for me, it's kind of an understanding that, one, in terms of how I approach it, I always try to remember this is intentional, right? This wasn't an accident. This wasn't just, we just needed to do labor and this is our only choice. No, there were choices made, right? Sugar was the biggest driver of the expansion of the slave trade. sugar, as grown from cane sugar, is not a necessity to live, right? We can get the needed sucrose from fruits, right? We don't need sugar to live. Yet 67% of all enslaved Africans who were transported through the Atlantic slave trade went to sugar plantations. That's where they were destined for. And so keeping that idea that this was intentional, this was human action, this was human law, this was human policy, human behavior in all its facets, right? It's something to hold on to as well. And I don't think it makes it easy, right? It definitely doesn't make it easy in any stretch, but it does, for me at least, allow a sense of context and a sense of how to hold these ideas of lived lives, of narratives, of stories, of resiliency, of pain, of struggle, of violence, of all that, of greed, right? That's what this speaks to. And so in doing these, looking at the table, you're kind of seeing it play out. And then my always follow-up question is, okay, as someone who's in education, how do I help to share that and disseminate that information in a way that's engaging and not kind of not a way of making someone feel like their families is being, or their identity, their people are being more victimized, if you will, right? So I'm in South Carolina now, right? And so, actually, literally earlier today, I was down in the Low Country and around Charleston area, and so you can't walk around Charleston without recognizing the slave trade, right? Like, well, you can. I mean, unfortunately, many people do.
Yeah, I wouldn't care. I'm gonna keep it real with you. I really, you know me, Brian. I'm not going to, and no pun intended, sugarcoat anything.
Yeah, no,
I literally would not. I'm not gonna sugarcoat anything. I'm not here to make you feel like a victim, but in the same instance, you have to know what you did, what was done. And I think that that's one of the biggest issues today when it comes to the education of both for both blacks and whites. Yeah. They don't know what they really did. Like it's not discussed. It's not talked about. It is, what is the word that I'm looking for? It's kept quiet. It's really kept quiet as far as slavery is concerned. And we have to open up on it, and we have to have that conversation, because in order for us to move forward from where we are today with the climate that we are in today, we have to have this conversation. So you're awesome for sugarcoating it and everything, but I'm gonna tell you now, I would never, to have the information that you have, they would know, and they better not come to me once I'm into it, and once I find a family member in it, I'm gonna tell you exactly what happened, and it is not gonna be pretty.
Oh yeah, and don't mistake making us in terms of making it engaging. This isn't about kind of making it more easier to swallow. That's not my intention at all. The point is, you want to make that whoever you're engaging with, you want them to understand the severity of it, the realness of it, and so you want to have them sit with it, right? Sit with that uncomfortableness. Sit with that sense of anger. Sit with that sense of pain, of how could this happen? It's like, not how, it did. And it happened over millennia, centuries, but then, how we want to spend. And it wasn't an accident of who were the people who were captured into this enslavement, right? It wasn't an accident, right? It was intentional who was done what. And so that's where it is. So I completely agree. The conversations around slavery have been either you don't talk about it at all, to no, just mention the good examples, the good master, which was Gone with the Wind type stuff, or you then create this sense, it was bad, but right. Thomas Jefferson was a great writer, but he also had slaves. But that's it. You don't go any further with that, right? That's how it's been told to us for so long, and that's what we need to disrupt, right? That's what we need to push back on in as many ways as possible. Right. So I appreciate that for sure. It is, yeah, absolutely.
You know me, because I always argue that we don't even have a vocabulary in this country, an agreed vocabulary framework to even be able to discuss it. But the thing that really hit me the hardest when I went to the slave voyages site the first time was when you start looking at the sheer volume of ships. Our ancestors could have gone anywhere. Because you start looking, it's really heavy towards South America, then you see the Caribbean coming into it, then you see America coming into it. And if you filter, say, any given year, say probably starting from the mid-1700s to the latter part, there are ships going everywhere.
Yeah.
And and they have hundreds of enslaved people in them.
Yeah.
So it really was just a fluke.
Yeah.
Where the enslaved Africans were ending up.
And one of the other elements that was only in the last year or so added to the site is the Intra-American Trade, right? So when people were brought to Havana, to Jamaica, to Charleston, they didn't necessarily stay in that country or that island. There was a very vibrant trade between the Caribbean and New Orleans, between the Caribbean and Charleston, between the Caribbean and Brazil. It was quite active, right? And so that tells another story of like, wait a minute, if I'm not finding the ship, so for example, the 1619, right, the White Lion, that ship is not a transatlantic ship; it's an intra-American ship, right? It intercepted the João Baptiste, which was a Portuguese ship heading for Mexico. It was intercepted. The White Lion and the Treasurer confiscated people from that ship, and those are the two that arrived in Virginia that 1619. In I believe what was it, August, and I think a couple months later. Right. So, right, those are inter-American ships. The Amistad, right, because it's so famous because of the revolt and also the movie. That's an intra-American trip. That was a ship that was going from one port in Cuba to another port in Cuba when they took control. And so that's kind of that other dynamic to it, that it wasn't a linear trade. It wasn't just things just went to one place. It was much more dynamic and global, right? I mean, when America and the U.S. abolished the slave trade, American slave traders, American shipbuilders, American captains continued to trade. They just sailed under a different flag. They were active in the trading to Cuba and in the trading to Brazil, exceedingly active. Some have argued that the shipbuilding industry of Baltimore, right, which is far after the slave trade was abolished, was in part fueled by the creation of slave ships for the Caribbean and Brazil. So it kind of speaks to how much of a global, really, a global scale this was.
And again, some of my DNA matches made sense because some of these ships would go from Africa to, say, Bermuda or Jamaica, sell a couple of enslaved Africans for provisions, whether that was for food, water, rum, whatever it was. Then they would come to the States. So you can think that's why we have DNA matches there. You think you have siblings or a parent and a child.
Yeah, I have another question, but I want you to ask these because these question is a very good one. So since you already have it pulled up, because I'm still sending people links.
Okay. One question that we have, and I'm going to try to summarize it, and it's from a viewer called D. We know the conditions that the Africans were held in Africa, the slave ports. What's the kind of sliding scale as to how long they were actually there for before they were actually put on the ships?
Oh, that's such a great question, because it's one that most people don't think about. When they think about the Middle Passage, they think just on a ship leaves, a ship arrives, and they're unloaded, right? They could be held before being put on board a ship for weeks. They could be held for weeks before the ship departs, and then on board the ship. And then they could be held on board the ship for weeks once it arrives at its port. Because if anyone's ever seen how ports function, right, a ship doesn't just show up and immediately it's allowed to dock and unload. There's a coordination in terms of how it's run, right? You have to get permission to offload. You have to wait for other ships to offload. And all the while, people are being held, right? And while there's this is the callous thinking of it, right? How insidious this was. There's, the captains and the owners want their cargo to survive, but they're not treated as humans either, right? You want them to survive because you want to earn money off of their body, but you're still gonna do what you will. You're still gonna treat them as cargo in that sense. So the amount of time before the Middle Passage, if you will, that journey actually took place, could be at least weeks, if not, like a full week to 2 weeks, and sometimes even longer, right? And it all had to do with what was going on at that time. If there was an outbreak of a disease, yellow fever, for example, at a port in let's say Ouida, right, in modern day Cameroon, right? Modern day Cameroon, Nigeria. The ships would be held before leaving, right? Because if there was an outbreak at the port, that the disease would be on board the ship, and those ships would actually have a much higher mortality rate, right? So they would hold them, and likely when they would arrive, say in Charleston, I grabbed one of these advertisements that we see in textbooks all the time, and it actually gives as a way to kind of show how important, prized, I'm using that really intentionally, the ship has not been in contact with Charleston, where there was a smallpox outbreak at the time. And so the ship was moored offshore, and there's been no contact with the land. Therefore, you really want to buy this group of people because they're not diseased, right? So, but the ship is held all the time. The people are held on board the ship.
In those tight quarters, they're just there.
So yes and no, right? So one of the dynamics of the actual transporting of people, which talking about learning something, right? I didn't realize this till just a few years ago, was during calm weather, during the day, most slave ships would bring the captives on deck, above deck, right? And then they'd be chained to this large chain and shackled to each other in pairs, and just the men. The women, for the most part, would be with women and children on the other side of the ship, barricaded from where the men were, right? And then at night, and it could be anywhere from 300 to 600 to however large number of people being carried, would be brought back down, chained back up in the hold, right? So whether or not they were, say, at the port or before they left or when they were leaving, whether or not they were below deck or above deck is hard to specify, right? Because it would have to do with, is there some threat of them resisting, right? Is there calm weather? By the way, none of it has to do with how you treat a person, but right, that's not in the conversation. It's really,
right.
Is there calm weather, or for some reason should they not be above deck? But yeah, so the journey is not just, so on the database you can see the average length of time, the middle passage, I believe is how the variable is labeled, and on average it's about 60 days. Right, but that average, if you're going to Brazil, that average is about 54 days from most likely Angola. If you're going to the U.S. to Charleston, that average is about 67 days, right? And that's a 2-week difference depending on the destination and of that ship. And so that's the longer someone is held in confinement, the increase of all the things of dysentery, dehydration. Gastrointestinal issues. I mean, it is something to behold that people were not just put through it, but it is, it's quite remarkable of how horrendous those conditions were, and sometimes worse than other places where people were brought up on charges for being so bad, right? And that's something that. It doesn't make it easier to understand.
Right.
But at no point did they stop and think, maybe we shouldn't be doing this. Because I'm just thinking about, there was a year in particular, and I can't remember what year it was, but Middleton and Brailsford, they were suffering huge losses from the transportation. They were losing as many as half of the enslaved Africans. Mm-hmm. And I'm reading correspondence. This is between men talking about human beings, going, well, how are we going to counteract this? But they're not talking about medicine or any of that kind of. Basically, it was the 18th century version of shine some light inside of you to get rid of COVID.
Get out. Okay.
That kind of conversation.
Okay.
Because you couldn't. I get it. You can't take them out of you can't take the men out of the chains because they're going to rebel. Because I'm getting a lot of sense that that was a real fear for them. As a matter of fact, that was the point that I had to stop my research on the weeping time. It was I was reading a letter from a Bristol-based English captain talking about how to set an example for the rest of the men on his ship. Someone did try to break free. He did break free, actually. He tried to get his comrades in arms out of their chains. They did not kill him directly. They cut him, and then they threw him overboard so that the sharks would get him. And I had to stop at that point.
That's why I can't.
So my question is, because I think it's easier for us to assume that our enslaved ancestors were docile.
I can't assume that. We have Martha in our family. Who can assume that she was docile at all?
But I'm thinking, as people new to research are going to probably think, well, they couldn't have fought very hard. But what was, because I'm still kind of new to this level of research and this kind of research. From your experience, how infrequent or frequent were kind of rebellions or escape attempts made on the ships?
So what's interesting is the rate of which, to phrase it in that language, the rate of resistance or rebellion actually affected the decisions made by traders, right? So there was an increase in revolts along what kind of the Senegambia and Sierra Leone region of West Africa. So that's Senegal, Gambia, modern day, a little bit into Cote d'Ivoire, but not as much. You can actually see there's an increase in the number of revolts on board or at the port, right? Most revolts took place, they didn't take place in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Most took place either near, relatively close to Africa, or near a port in the Americas, right? Kind of when land was in sight, for the most part. What would happen was then the traders would slowly begin avoiding those ports. They began looking for captives from Angola was, almost 5.5 million people were taken out of modern day Angola, West Central Africa, right? The interpretation that they were somehow more docile is a skewed thing, as if it's a character trait of the individual, right? It actually has to do with more so the structure of the trade that existed on the continent, right? In that region, the different kingdoms, who was in control, who engaged in the trade, right? It gets into that speaks to the degree to which the amount of trade. It wasn't like one group was more warrior spirit type. That's not really the takeaway, right? Because you don't have the evidence of people's kind of characters, right? Some argued that in West Africa, because of the wider spread of Islam, you had more Africans or captives who were literate and in Arabic as well as their other languages, if you will, right? And that literacy in Arabic facilitated more communication, which could lead to more revolts, right? Which there was a famous one in Brazil in 1835, led by Muslim slaves, right? In the U.S., that happened out in I think the Stonewall Rebellion, right? It was organized by Arabic speaking, right? So there's different dynamics that people have argued are contributing factors, but the fact remains, you can clearly see, at least in the incidents reports, if you will, that there was a greater number earlier on in certain periods from that part of West Africa, and you would see the trade slowly, and for other reasons, not just that, but you can see still a correlation between the incidences of revolt on board ships leaving or at port in Africa, or just off the coast, and then the slave traders looking to go to other ports that either had more, how do I say this? The trade networks were more stable, if that makes sense, in terms of how captives were brought in and how the stability of the kingdoms that engaged in the trade, the different African kingdoms that engaged in the trade. You found there was more stability in some places and more, and so the number of revolts were not as high in those areas.
So one question that I also have, and I don't know if you have an answer for it, I don't know if any historian actually has an answer to this one, but as you pointed out, the enslavement of Africans was a century-old thing. It was being done way before the English and the French did it, going back to the Spanish and the Portuguese. So have you ever seen any evidentiary kind of writing or comments amongst the Africans who at some point had to have realized, wait a minute, we're sending all of these people, we're sending our brothers and sisters over this ocean, but none of them are coming back. Because Africans practiced a different form of slavery. It wasn't, for the most part, it wasn't a life sentence.
Right.
Whereas, but I have to think at some point, they had to think, wait a minute, we've just sent hundreds, if not thousands of people. It's 20 years on, and none of them have come back.
But why would they think that if they were fighting them and it was the spoils?
But I said most African slaves were spoils, but they had, after a certain point of time, they could either go home, they could stay part of the tribe, they could marry. It wasn't a lifelong condition.
True, but that was within each other. They were sending them with someone else, so this wasn't them.
But they might have thought that the Europeans had the same. Again, we don't have a language for this. That maybe the Europeans had the same approach to it that they had.
Did. Okay.
But at some point, the penny had to drop. No one was coming back.
Yeah, you really hit on such a kind of a level of complexity of trying to understand how could this play out in the way that it did, right? Because we know Europeans weren't the ones who physically went into the continent, especially at that period, right? Their imperial kind of hold over Africa was actually after the slave trade for the most part, the transatlantic component. There's still an Indian Ocean trade that carried on. But it was the existing kind of network of trade in people, mostly war captives, right? That they kind of, I'll say exploited, right? Kind of, and they grew to such a degree. I believe the historian is Butch Ware. I think he's at the University of Michigan. He's written on how the role that not just Islam in part, but he's looking at in West Africa, I believe, around the Gold Coast and Sierra Leone region, on how the resistance to the trade, not just revolts on board ships, but the actual kind of more organized resistance that took place on the continent of Africa, right? And which is speaking to kind of, I think, part of your question of, when did they learn that this was not the same type of captivity, that people were being held not just for their lives, but their children's. It was inherited. Right? The slavery was not just the life of the person being sold, it was their offspring as well. And this is the role of the exploitation and rape of women is so significant to this, because it's expanding the forced labor, right? And so there's different arguments in terms of when did a more collective, if you will, African identity come into play. Right? When did it emerge change from a Fanti selling an Akan or Ewe person into slavery? They might as well be selling a European, right? They're just as different as they are to them. However, so it varies of when does that, I'm going to say consciousness, but I don't mean like in kind of a complete epiphany, but when was that thought kind of emerged? It varies, right? And it's been argued that it's in, as early as the 1700s, or maybe even earlier in some parts, but not in others. Did it start somewhere and spread? Did it kind of simultaneously, the resistance to it? Was it just because of who was in charge in those regions, right? Or if there were warring tribes or states within Africa, among Africans, did that factor into it, right? But either way, definitely by the 17th and 18th century, or 18th and 19th century, definitely, there was a much greater understanding of what was happening, right? Because you also have to remember the crew of many of these ships, Africans were part of the slave ship crew too, not in large numbers, right? But there was a mixture. There was information coming back. People who worked in the port of the varying places, they knew there was conversations and details being shared, right? So it's debatable about when, if you will, or how widespread that awareness takes hold, right? But there is definitely resistance in Africa to the selling of other Africans. In some contexts, this is where the religion kind of comes into play in differing ways, right? we're against the selling of Muslims. Well, also in others, right? It's kind of bad, but we're focused on our group too, right? So there's a nuance to it, right? And it's not all Muslims are one way or not, and it's not all, but you want to, the arguments are around that there is resistance in Africa, which is a really important thing that we don't often talk about, especially in the US. We don't talk about, we sometimes will use the phrase the African side of the trade, kind of as in, they sold us in that and language.
That's it, right.
Right? But we don't talk about, wait a minute, did everyone sell? No. People resisted. People didn't want their family members sold. People didn't want their neighbors sold. And there was resistance. But when and how and to what degree is an ongoing question. But we do know that it happened. Is definitely there.
Well, because we have one person who actually made the comment. He was like, "Well, were they expected to come back after being sold?" So, like for example, if I'm selling you to somebody, am I talking to them like, okay, well, this is the trade deal. You have him for this amount of time, and then I expect him back. Was that kind of thing even done? Like, do they have that kind of writings that are in these books? And so, obviously they lied. I mean, because they didn't send them back.
Whether or not an African person who engaged in the trade had expectation that I'm just selling a prisoner, and just like it's practiced, maybe earlier on in the years of the trade, when the Portuguese were just doing off the coast to the island of Madeira or Sao Tome and Principe, the islands just off the coast of Africa, which were, this not to demean it, but somewhat kind of trial sugar plantations, right, where they were getting a sense of how possible this was to scale it. And then by the 1500s, right, Spain is the first slave ship, right, I think now is fairly comfortably the 1520 ship to Puerto Rico, sorry. But anyway, whether or not they knew, that's harder to say, or they expected that they would return. I would say that as that consciousness, and again, I'm a little hesitant on using that word, as if, just you had no sense of it, right? And whether or not that started to matter. But the resistance does come up further, even as the European colonial powers kind of had a stronger and stronger input, and you saw more and more people being sold. That doesn't mean resistance wasn't happening. It could mean that it wasn't as effective as they'd like it to be, but it doesn't mean it wasn't happening.
Actually, I think this is probably a question from one of us. Someone's confused by 6% European Jewish in their DNA. And I have a partial answer for that, as in both in the American colonies and the Caribbean colonies. There were Jewish people who were involved in the slave trade like the rest of the Europeans were.
Pretty much.
Actually, one of I'm just going to leave it there. They were involved in that, so that's how that DNA happened.
Right. And then we also have a lot of people who are asking about, like, where can they find your research and things like that. And we will be sharing the website on this particular thing. But if you want to go into, like, briefly what's on your website for them so that they know, what it is that they're looking for, that would be great.
Can I just jump in for a hot sec? Kudos to whoever designed your website and the way that they've done the database. It is so flexible. You can search by year, by name of ship, by name of captain, all of that stuff.
I will definitely relay that message. I'm smiling because I'm not a programmer, right?
It's a student.
not at all. The programs we've had quite a few, but there's been kind of like maybe four of them who've just, the two who initially built it, the earliest version, kind of laid the foundation. Then one gentleman, Domingos, Brazilian computer science doctor, who just stayed with him to this day, is kind of our problem solver, our person to think about how can we make this data that's not clean. It's historical, right? Some records survive, many don't. They're incomplete. It doesn't tell us all the information. It doesn't have dates of everything. It doesn't have the breakdown of gender or sex, as you were alluding to earlier on. How do we make this functional? How do we allow the search? And we actually just did a big update just a couple of days ago of the code to make sure there were some errors that were coming up, or people were having some delayed results. And so I'm really appreciative, and I will definitely relay that to at our weekly meetings around that it's appreciated, because it is something that, I mean, I like to say I've been, you know, in the conversation alongside them at times of like the work they've done to the coding part that behind the site, if you will. It's been nothing short of just, you know, it's I like that they've told me a few times, like, this actually piqued their interest, right? It's different from normal computer science or different types of big data digital projects. This is quite unique, obviously in the context of enslavement and captivity and the human suffering, but also in the nature of the records. What is actually telling and what is it not? Even more importantly, what's it not telling, right? What stories are not being told by the data there?
Right.
So in the final, I think we have a minute.
Okay. Yeah, so just real quickly, the website so that they will know where to go.
Yeah. So it's slavevoyages.org, all one word. And on that site, you'll find, I think I mentioned there's effectively 5 databases on the site. There's the transatlantic database. I would encourage people to also look at the estimates component, because that gives a sense of, well, what's not there, right? It estimates upwards the number of people and the number of ships. Then there's the Intra-American, which tries to get that Caribbean, the Spanish Caribbean, but not as much, mostly the English and Charleston, let's say. The African names database, though, unfortunately, most likely people wouldn't be able to trace their family to those individuals unless they already know that they're kind of descendants of liberated Africans in either Sierra Leone or Havana, Cuba, right? Okay. Which were a particular group of people who have a story in and of themselves, but it's their names, their people, right? The individuals. But I would also encourage people to look at the time lapse that we updated and placed on the site. I think there's a link to the homepage, on the homepage. Just to get that scale, it's color-coded dots, and each circle corresponds to the number of people brought on board on any given ship. And you can see that some ships are carrying as few as, 10 or 12, and as many as 12 to 1,300 people on board a ship.
Wow.
And where they're going.
Wow.
So, yeah, there are a lot of things, hopefully, to engage with the site. And our email, and they can reach out and report feedback or use through the site itself. So we definitely encourage, we get those emails and we respond to them as well.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Nafeez. This was a really very interesting and enlightening show, and I still have a question for you, but I'll do it on the back end later on. You'll get an email from me, because I do have one other question, but you'll get it on an email. But this was awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining us on this show. And would you like to introduce quickly next week?
Yes, next week's show we are actually going to be talking with the librarian Hollis Gentry from the National Museum of African American History and Culture. So you guys definitely need to check that out, because there are great resources at that museum that a lot of people don't even know about, and she's going to share that.
Indeed, we're looking forward to that. And thank you so much for spending your Sunday for us, and you will find that we actually have quite a few shows posted in our events calendar, so definitely check that out. And until next week, again, thank you, Nafeez, for joining us. Thank you as well.
Thank you.
See you guys next week.
See you guys next week. Thanks.